Why did ancient Egypt never conquer Mesopotamia? Egypt controlled the Nile Valley for over 3,000 years without a single rival empire threatening its core territory from the east. In that same period, Egypt's armies reached deep into Nubia and planted garrisons across the entire Levant. They also conducted raids as far north as the Euphrates River, the boundary of the ancient Near East. Thutmose III, the pharaoh historians call the Napoleon of Egypt, stood at that river and erected a stele. That stone marker stood on the western bank of the Euphrates, the furthest point any Egyptian army had ever reached. He was less than 700 miles from Babylon, the richest city in the world at the time. He had the army. He had the momentum. He had just completed 17 military campaigns without a single meaningful defeat. Every Egyptian pharaoh who ever reached the Euphrates made the same decision without exception. They stopped, planted a boundary marker on the western bank, and marched their armies back to the Nile. For 3,000 years, Egypt never once attempted to cross that river and absorb Mesopotamia into its empire. This is not a minor historical curiosity. Mesopotamia was the other half of the ancient world's economic engine. It was home to Babylon, to Assyria, and to the very first cities in recorded human history. It held resources Egypt lacked, trade routes Egypt needed, and cities wealthier than almost anything in Africa or the Levant. So why did the most powerful civilization in the ancient world never try to take it? The answer forces you to reconsider everything you assumed about how Egypt understood power and survival. More importantly, it raises the question of what Egypt believed an empire was actually for in the first place. To understand why Egypt never crossed into Mesopotamia, you must first set aside one common assumption. These were not simply two powerful civilizations that happened to exist at the same time and compete for territory. They were two fundamentally different answers to the same basic human problem. The problem was this: how do you build a stable civilization inside a world that is mostly hostile? Egypt's answer was the Nile. And the Nile was unlike any other river in the ancient world in one critical way. It flooded on a schedule so reliable that Egyptian priests could predict it years in advance, using nothing more than careful observation. Every year at the same time, the Nile rose and deposited a thin layer of extraordinarily fertile black silt. Then it retreated, leaving behind a valley floor that was one of the most productive agricultural surfaces on Earth. The Egyptians called this black soil Kemet, which was also one of their own words for Egypt itself. The land and its fertility were not two separate concepts in Egyptian thought. They were the same thing. Farming in the Nile Valley did not require the constant anxious intervention that farming elsewhere always demanded. The river handled the most difficult work, leaving farmers free to focus on planting, harvesting, and storage. Egyptian farmers planted into soil that had just been renewed by the annual flood and then left behind. They worked under a sun that barely varied from year to year, in a climate of remarkable consistency. Yields were extraordinarily consistent. Famines happened, but they were caused by abnormal flood levels, not by the inherent instability of the system. This predictability shaped Egyptian civilization at every level, from its theology to its calendar to its deep psychological relationship with time itself. Egyptian religion did not center on anxious gods competing against chaos and uncertainty. It revolved instead around maintaining a cosmic order the Egyptians called Ma'at, the principle of balanced truth. Ma'at meant truth, balance, and the correct ordering of all things in the universe. The core belief was that the cosmos had a proper arrangement, and Egypt's role was to preserve it. The pharaoh was not simply a king in any sense that a modern audience would easily recognize. He was the living embodiment of Ma'at, the human mechanism through which cosmic order itself was maintained. This theology had a practical consequence that almost no one talks about when they discuss Egyptian military history. Egypt did not expand to grow. It expanded to protect what already existed. Every campaign into Nubia, every garrison established in the Levant, every treaty signed with the Hittites served the same fundamental purpose. They were not expressions of Egyptian hunger for more territory. They were defensive operations dressed in the language of conquest. Mesopotamia worked on completely different principles. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, and sometimes with a violence that destroyed rather than renewed. They did not deposit the same reliable layer of fertile silt that made the Nile so uniquely productive. Mesopotamian farmers had to actively manage every aspect of their water supply through extensive canal networks. Those canals, dikes, and irrigation channels required constant maintenance just to keep the fields producing at all. If the canals fell into disrepair, the fields could dry up within a single growing season. If the floods arrived at the wrong time or with the wrong intensity, the entire harvest was lost. This agricultural precariousness produced a civilization that was fundamentally more anxious, more competitive, and more militarized than Egypt ever was. Mesopotamian city-states competed aggressively for water rights and control over the canals that sustained agriculture. Fertile land was not simply valuable in Mesopotamia. It was the resource that determined who survived at all. Their gods were not keepers of cosmic order in the Egyptian sense. They were powerful and unpredictable forces that had to be constantly appeased through ritual, sacrifice, and correct behavior. Mesopotamian kings derived their legitimacy not from being the embodiment of eternal order, but from demonstrating ongoing capacity to protect and provide. A Mesopotamian king who stopped expanding was a king who appeared to be visibly failing his people. Expansion meant more resources, more tribute, and more visible proof that the gods still favored his reign. An Egyptian pharaoh who stopped expanding was simply a pharaoh who had finished the job of securing Egypt's borders. These were not two civilizations with similar goals operating at different scales of ambition. They were two civilizations with fundamentally different definitions of what power was actually designed to accomplish. Even if Egypt had genuinely wanted to conquer Mesopotamia, the practical obstacles alone were extraordinarily severe. Any pharaoh who calculated the costs honestly would have found serious reason to stop at the Euphrates. The distance from Memphis, Egypt's administrative capital, to Babylon was approximately 1,400 miles in a straight line. In the ancient world, armies never moved in straight lines across maps the way modern planners assume. They followed available water sources, avoided mountain ranges, and traveled at the pace of their slowest supply carts. A realistic marching route from Egypt to Babylon followed the coastal road north through the Levant. Continuing northeast through Syria to reach Babylon brought the total realistic distance closer to 2,000 miles. Ancient armies marched at roughly 15 to 20 miles per day under reasonably good conditions. At that pace, the journey from Egypt to Babylon in one direction alone took 3 to 4 months. That is 3 to 4 months of feeding, watering, and maintaining an army in territory that did not belong to you. Egypt's military logistics were formidable by any ancient standard, but they depended on one critical requirement: That requirement was reliable access to the Nile River as the primary backbone of supply and communication. Egyptian supply systems relied on river transport to move grain, equipment, and reinforcements across large distances. No other method of supply could match the Nile's capacity for moving heavy loads quickly and efficiently. The Nile was not simply a geographical feature of Egypt. It was the logistical backbone of every Egyptian military operation ever conducted. Every campaign into Nubia followed the river south, using the current for supply and communication alike. Every major operation into the Sinai launched from delta bases that had been fully stocked by river transport. Even Thutmose III's Levantine campaigns depended on Egyptian ships running supplies up the Mediterranean coast. Without that maritime supply line keeping the army fed, the northern campaigns could not have been sustained. Past the Euphrates River, none of that logistical infrastructure existed or could easily be replicated. Egypt would have been operating in territory where its single greatest military advantage simply did not apply. The terrain beyond the Euphrates created its own set of problems that went beyond simple distance. Northern Mesopotamia between the two rivers was a flat and largely featureless plain prone to unpredictable flooding. It offered very limited natural defensive positions and no geographical features that Egypt's army could exploit easily. Holding that kind of territory required a permanent network of fortified garrisons spread across hundreds of miles. Those garrisons needed their own supply lines, their own local administrators, and their own communication systems. Egypt had built exactly this kind of infrastructure in Nubia over several centuries of gradual expansion. A chain of fortresses along the Nile allowed effective control of a region nearly 1,200 miles long. But Nubia was manageable because the Nile provided the communication and supply line that connected every fortress back to Egypt proper. In Mesopotamia, no such ready-made communication line existed anywhere between Egypt and the Tigris River. Building one from scratch would have required an enormous investment of resources with no guaranteed return. There is also a military factor that popular accounts of Egyptian warfare almost never discuss at all. Professional military historians, however, consider it one of the most significant constraints Egypt actually faced. Egypt's army was superbly suited to the specific campaigns that Egypt's strategic situation actually required. Raids into Nubia, punitive expeditions into the Levant, and defense of fixed border positions were its specialties. It was not designed or structured for the kind of sustained, deep penetration campaigning that conquering and holding Mesopotamia would have required. The Egyptian chariot corps was the most prestigious element of the New Kingdom military establishment. It was devastatingly effective in the open terrain of the Levant and across the flat Nile Valley floodplain. Mesopotamia's dense irrigation canal networks would have broken Egyptian chariot formations apart immediately upon entry. Chariots would have been funneled into predictable corridors, where infantry ambushes were straightforward to organize. The populations Egypt would have needed to govern in Mesopotamia were fundamentally unlike any it had managed before. Nubian and Canaanite societies were structured in ways that Egyptian administrative models could absorb relatively easily. Egyptian administration worked by installing a garrison presence and then working through existing local elite structures. That model had proven effective in Nubia and the Levant, where social organization was manageable from above. Mesopotamian civilization was as administratively sophisticated as Egypt itself in almost every meaningful respect. It had its own deep bureaucratic traditions, its own religious hierarchies, and its own theories of legitimate rulership. Absorbing Mesopotamia would not have meant imposing Egyptian administration over a simpler or less organized society. It would have meant trying to superimpose Egyptian administrative culture directly over one that was equally complex. No ancient empire had ever successfully done that at that scale, and Egypt had absolutely no institutional template for attempting it. And then there was the question of what Egypt would actually gain from the effort. Mesopotamia's primary economic value in the Bronze Age came from its position as a major trading hub. It connected the Persian Gulf, the Iranian Plateau, and the Mediterranean world through networks of long-distance commerce. Egypt already accessed most of what that trade produced through its control of the Levantine coast. Commercial relationships with major Mesopotamian kingdoms brought the remaining goods into Egyptian markets without direct control. The metals, timber, luxury goods, and manufactured products that Mesopotamia distributed were already flowing into Egypt. They arrived through diplomatic exchange and commercial trade, without Egypt bearing any cost of direct occupation. Egypt was capturing the economic benefits of Mesopotamia's trade network without controlling Mesopotamia at all. This arrangement gave Egypt access to the goods it needed, while avoiding every cost of direct administration. This was not an accident of geography or circumstance. It was a deliberate and maintained strategic choice. Egypt had figured out how to extract maximum value from a trade system without having to own all of it. At least 3 distinct moments in Egyptian history tested the logic of stopping at the Euphrates River. Each of those moments presented a genuine opportunity for expansion eastward, and each time Egypt chose otherwise. The first came during the reign of Thutmose III, roughly 1479 to 1425 BC. He was the pharaoh who took Egypt's military power further and higher than it had ever gone before. Thutmose fought 17 campaigns into the Levant and Syria across roughly 20 years of continuous warfare. He systematically dismantled every coalition that the cities and kingdoms of the region assembled against him. He defeated the Mitanni kingdom, which controlled northern Syria and the upper Euphrates, in multiple engagements. Those victories pushed Egyptian forces all the way to the western bank of the Euphrates River itself. At that moment, Thutmose commanded arguably the most capable and battle-hardened army Egypt had ever assembled. He also possessed solid intelligence about the political situation and the military landscape beyond the Euphrates. The Mitanni were significantly weakened by the campaigns Thutmose had just completed against their forces. The Babylonians to the south were in political transition. The timing was as favorable as it would ever be. Thutmose erected his boundary stele on the western bank of the Euphrates as a formal marker of Egypt's reach. He hunted elephants in the marshes of northern Syria as a display of power, then returned home to the Nile. He did not cross the river. He did not attempt to reduce the weakened Mitanni to an Egyptian province. He accepted their tribute instead, establishing a relationship of nominal Egyptian dominance over the region. His successors Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV continued the same pattern without deviation. They accepted Mitanni tribute and eventually concluded a formal peace that converted the Mitanni into an Egyptian ally. Managing the Euphrates frontier diplomatically rather than militarily was not a failure of nerve or ambition. It was a deliberate strategic policy, consistently maintained across multiple reigns and several generations of pharaohs. The second critical moment came during the reign of Ramesses II, roughly 1279 to 1213 BC. It emerged directly from the aftermath of the most famous battle Egypt ever fought, the Battle of Kadesh. Kadesh was the largest chariot engagement in the ancient world by any reasonable estimate of scale. It was fought between Egypt and the Hittite Empire in what is now the territory of central Syria. Both sides claimed victory after Kadesh, and neither side was telling the complete truth about what happened. The actual outcome was a costly stalemate that left neither empire in a meaningfully stronger position. What followed was not another attempt at conquest. It was the world's first recorded peace treaty, the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty of 1259 BC. This treaty established a fixed boundary between the two empires and created a framework of mutual defense. Diplomatic correspondence and royal intermarriage between Egypt and the Hittites followed, and the arrangement held for generations. Ramesses could have leveraged Egypt's considerable resources to push for a more decisive outcome after Kadesh. He chose negotiation instead. The treaty was not a concession of weakness. It was a recognition of a fundamental strategic truth. Managing the Levant through diplomacy was cheaper, more sustainable, and more sound than trying to conquer it outright. The Hittite Empire sat directly between Egypt and any possible route toward Mesopotamia. Defeating the Hittites decisively would have opened a clear path toward the Euphrates and potentially beyond it. Ramesses chose not to take that path under any circumstances whatsoever. He signed a treaty with the Hittites, sent his daughter to marry the Hittite king as a diplomatic gesture. His energy went not toward further eastern expansion, but toward the enormous building projects along the Nile. The third moment is the most revealing of all three, and it came during a period of Egyptian weakness. This was not a moment of confident power looking for new targets. It was a moment of genuine vulnerability. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapse swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean world without warning. It destroyed the Hittite Empire, destabilized every Levantine city-state, and disrupted every major trade network in the region. Egypt survived the collapse, barely, under Ramesses III, who fought off multiple incursions by the Sea Peoples at Egypt's northern frontier. In the chaotic aftermath of the collapse, the Hittites were gone, and Mesopotamia was weakened and fragmented. Egypt faced a strategic environment with no precedent in its entire recorded history up to that point. The traditional powers that had defined Egypt's northeastern frontier had simply ceased to exist as functioning states. There was now no major organized military force standing between Egypt's border and the Tigris River. Egypt did not advance to fill the vacuum that the collapse had suddenly created. Instead, it contracted, withdrawing from its Levantine garrisons and pulling its frontier inward toward the Nile itself. This was not a weakness in any conventional military or political sense of that word. This was Egyptian strategic logic, operating exactly as it always had, prioritizing core security over peripheral expansion. When the surrounding world became unstable, Egypt did not move to exploit that instability by expanding into it. Egypt's response was consistent with 3,000 years of prior strategic behavior. Protect what you already hold. 3 opportunities, 3 entirely different strategic environments, and the same fundamental Egyptian answer each time. The Nile was enough. Whatever lay beyond the Euphrates was not worth the cost of trying to take it. The question of why Egypt never conquered Mesopotamia seems, at first, like a question about military capacity or geographical limitation. It is neither. It is a question about what Egypt fundamentally believed an empire was supposed to accomplish. The empires that did conquer Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Macedonia, and Rome, all operated on the same basic logic. More territory meant more tribute. More tribute meant more military capacity. More military capacity meant the ability to take more territory. This logic produced some of the most impressive military achievements in human history. It also produced the most spectacular collapses. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which finally did conquer Egypt in 671 BC, was Mesopotamia's greatest military achievement. It was by any measure the most powerful military force the ancient Near East had ever produced, up to that point. It collapsed completely within 60 years of that conquest, destroyed by a coalition of its own former subjects. Those subjects had simply been pushed past the point where tolerating Assyrian extraction remained rational for them. The Achaemenid Persian Empire ruled from Egypt all the way east to the borders of India. It was the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, and Alexander destroyed it in less than a decade. Rome eventually absorbed both Egypt and Mesopotamia into a single imperial system. It then spent roughly 3 centuries in progressively worsening administrative collapse before the western half stopped functioning. Every empire operating on the expansion as survival model eventually reached the same critical breaking point. The cost of maintaining the frontier grew until it exceeded the economic value that the frontier actually produced. Egypt never reached that point, not because it lacked the ambition, but because it never adopted the model in the first place. The Egyptian approach was what modern strategists would recognize as a form of rational resource allocation. No ancient Egyptian would have used those words, but the underlying logic would have been immediately familiar. Egypt controlled the minimum territory necessary to secure the Nile Valley's agricultural output and productivity. Beyond that, it protected only the trade routes that supplied what the Nile itself could not produce locally. It maintained buffer zones in Nubia and the Levant, not primarily to extract their resources for Egyptian use. The purpose was to ensure no rival power could use those regions as a base to threaten Egypt directly. When a region became stable enough to manage through diplomacy rather than military garrisons, Egypt chose diplomacy. Diplomacy was cheaper than garrisons, and cheaper meant more resources available for investment along the Nile itself. There is something counterintuitive about recognizing Egypt's restraint as strategic sophistication rather than timidity. The historical record rewards aggression with attention and memory, so restraint tends to look like weakness from outside. We remember Alexander for his conquests and Caesar for his relentless military campaigns across the ancient world. History has never developed a strong vocabulary for celebrating the strategic wisdom of deciding not to conquer something. But consider the actual outcome. Alexander's empire fragmented immediately after his death. Caesar's Rome eventually consumed itself. By the time Alexander arrived and declared himself pharaoh in 332 BC, Egypt had a specific distinction. It had already been a continuously functioning civilization for over 2,500 years without interruption. No empire that tried to conquer Mesopotamia lasted as long as Egypt lasted by choosing not to. The deeper point is about what the Nile made possible that no amount of Mesopotamian conquest could have replicated. The Nile's predictable flooding created a surplus economy reliable enough to support multiple specialized institutions simultaneously. Egypt could maintain a professional administrative class, a full-time priesthood, and a standing army all at once. That stability allowed Egyptian culture to develop with a continuity impossible in more contested or precarious environments. The artistic, architectural, and intellectual achievements that resulted are still genuinely extraordinary to encounter today. The pyramids at Giza were not built by an empire straining to hold on to newly conquered territory. They were built by a civilization confident enough in its own long-term stability to invest in permanent stone monuments. The Valley of the Kings was not carved by a kingdom anxious about whether it would survive another generation. It was created by a culture that expected to exist long enough to need burial chambers carved at that scale. That expectation, in itself, tells you something important about how Egypt understood its own position in the world. Egyptian civilization was, in a very real sense, the direct product of one foundational strategic choice. Egypt chose to be defined by what it protected rather than by the extent of what it had conquered. So the answer to the question of why Egypt never conquered Mesopotamia is this. Egypt never conquered Mesopotamia because Egypt did not need Mesopotamia in any fundamental strategic sense. And crucially, Egypt understood the difference between what it genuinely needed and what it simply could take. That distinction is one of the rarest qualities in the entire history of powerful states. Identifying your actual requirements for survival and resisting the temptation to pursue maximum possible expansion instead is extraordinarily difficult. Most powerful states eventually reach a point where the logic of their own power seems to demand more power. That cycle, expansion generating the need for further expansion, typically ends only when the cycle finally breaks the state itself. Egypt found a different equilibrium and held it for 3,000 years. Every empire that ever tried to conquer Egypt eventually disappeared. Egypt outlasted all of them, not because it was stronger, because it understood, better than any of its rivals, exactly how much was enough. If this made you see ancient Egypt differently, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. What do you think? Was Egypt's restraint genuine strategic wisdom? Or did Egypt simply never find a pharaoh ambitious enough to try?